Just want to remind our viewers what you said, the government said as part of their manifesto pledge, this to increase the defence budget each year by 0.5% above inflation. Will the government be abiding by that pledge?
Well, I think a number 10 spokesman said yesterday that they thought that was unlikely given the significant changes to inflation. As Defence Secretary, my most important target is remaining above 2%, if not greater, of GDP, which is the main NATO benchmark. And, I think that's really important that we continue to commit to that, if not greater. And I think that's what we're all here to discuss today in Madrid.
2% enough?
Well, we're currently above 2%. For this spending period, that's the 4 years of spending settlement I got from the Treasury, we are on target to meet our 2%. And we're also on target in other areas with our sort of defence reforms. The question is really the next spending period, the middle of the decade. We were prepared to take certain vulnerabilities on board in the middle of the decade as we got rid of some equipment and re-equipped with new. I think the invasion of Russia into Ukraine has changed that. And that's why I think the discussions are so important for the sort of middle of the decade funding. So between now and my comprehensive spending review settlement, which ends in 2024, the here and now, we are rightly set. We've got £24 billion of record settlement. The question is what happens in the middle of the decade and the future if security and threat becomes more of an issue.
Is 2.14% enough?
I'm a Defence Secretary of the Department. All departmental heads, Kay, will say they want more money. Of course, in the here and now, absolutely, we have enough money. We have enough money for next year as well. What you discover in government, in different departments, is despite getting sums, you've got to then spend them properly. And I've been determined to make sure we are spending our money and getting it out the door. I think what you'll see across the whole range of government departments is that despite settlements, it's often quite hard you can't immediately start building a hospital or immediately start building roads. And that's no different for defence. So look, for the here and now and for that comprehensive spending review settlement, we are absolutely in the right place. Post-2024 is really the discussions I have with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister that I feel, and I said in a speech yesterday, that, the security of this country is vital. The work the men and women of our armed forces do is incredibly important. We've all basked in their success in helping with COVID, with Afghanistan not pitting, and now leading from the front on Ukraine. And I think that means that Britain wants to maintain its leadership role post-2024. We're going to have to see probably greater investment. We've spent 40 years nearly taking a peace dividend out of the end of the Cold War. Sometimes it's important to invest. The Prime Minister changed that direction of travel, which was excellent news back in 2020 when he did the settlement, gave me the record funding. That was a change of what had happened for decades previously, where people took money out of defence every time. So we need to continue that direction of investment. And if we do, I think we'll be able to give an armed forces that continues to help us lead around the world.
OK, you're telling my viewers that for now we're in the right place. Yesterday, you said for too long, defence has lived on a diet of smoke and mirrors, hollowed out formations and fantasy efficiency savings.
Yeah, and that's why the Prime Minister changed that direction with my settlement 2020. The £24 billion, a net increase in defence spending, the biggest since the Cold War, was exactly to answer that point. So it actually says that in the full speech, Kay. If you read further into the speech, you'll see me say that. That's why the Prime Minister reversed decades of direction of travel on defence. The key for me as Defence Secretary is to make sure that government's appetite for using its defence forces is matched by its resources puts in place. I can deliver an armed forces to keep Britain safe. I can deliver an armed forces to be able to support our allies in the world and stand up for our values. But that obviously has to be cut to our cloth. And I think that's really important that we always make sure we do it. In the past, in history, prime ministers around have often volunteered defence to do all sorts of things and never then funded it. This Prime Minister has done that. But I'm just really keen that we recognise that my settlement was done before Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia is very, very dangerous now on the world stage. The world is less secure than it was 2-3 years ago and is not looking likely to change for the rest of the decade. I think that's an important moment in the middle of the decade to say we should commit to increased funding.
OK, I read in my weekend papers that you wrote to the Prime Minister asking for a 20% hike in military spending. Was that the case?
No.
How much would you like?
Well, how long is a piece of string? Look, I can see opportunities all over the world, Kay, to put the front foot forward of the British forces. Again, that goes back to my earlier point about the appetite of the government and how much it wants to do. Of course, I want always enough to meet the threat. You know, my duty to you, to the citizens of the UK, and indeed to the country and our allies, is to provide the government with a defence force capable enough to defend against the threats. If the threat changes, then we should always consider that type of investment to match it. We do that in many other departments around government. You know, when the NHS comes under winter pressures for decades and decades, you know, chancellors of the day have stepped up and invested to meet that response. Obviously, you know, winter pressures in the army are slightly different. They take place over 5-6 years. But nevertheless, if the threat changes, we should always be open to increasing that funding. I've said that a number of occasions before. That's the right way to do it, because I'm a threat-led organisation. And for now, between now and 2024, we are in the right place. Okay. The question becomes next, what happens next?
Okay. As Defence Secretary, are you completely content that as a country we spend apparently proportionally less than Greece, Lithuania and Estonia?
Well, I think, look, we are actually the second biggest spender at the moment in Europe. We are also, I think, the third biggest spender in the world in defence. So we spend a lot of money, if you talk about in cash terms, on defence. Obviously, Britain's GDP, or Britain's economy, is far bigger than some of those countries you've just listed. And therefore, if you spend even a baseline of defence that comes close to 1% or 2% that would be comparable to us, you'll discover that, you know, some of those countries, that higher percentage reflects the fact their economy is much smaller. But overall, we have been the leader. I'm determined that we stay the leader in the pack of that defence spend. And that's why I'm keen that we address the sort of post-2024 period.
What's the point of having a manifesto pledge like 0.5% above inflation spending on the defence budget, or saying that 300,000 new homes per year are going to be built by the mid-2020s, or saying that 0.70% of GDP will be spent on foreign aid, or that we're going to get full fibre broadband around the country by 2025? Point of a manifesto if you don't keep your promises?
Well, first of all, I've been in politics long enough, Kate, to have seen every government not fulfil 100% its manifesto.
What's the point then?
Well,
what's the point of a manifesto if you're not going to keep your promise?
Manifesto is an offer to the public, Kay. It's saying what we are going to try and deliver as a government. It is, you can call it a promise. We promise to try and do these things, but some things
So it's more of a wish list than a promise?
Right, okay, look, do I think the manifesto we have today would look the same if it had been written post-COVID or during COVID? I think it would have been different. And I think COVID was a once in 100 year, once in a 100 year plus type issue. And also we have an economic issue, that means we have to. I mean, a responsible government would take difficult decisions in light of the facts changing. I've just been saying to UK about threat. If threat changes, we should change our investments in defence with it. It is a perfectly legitimate position to be in. And I think if the economic situation has changed, or things are harder to deliver than people thought, and remember, to be fair, it's not always as straightforward. There are always other factors that affect us. These things sometimes take longer than we would have liked. But it doesn't mean to say it's not an aspiration. Under this government, the Prime Minister did absolutely change the defence investment. He did something that hadn't been done for decades. And if inflation hadn't lifted off basically this year, we would be on track to meet our 0.5%.
Okay. Talk to me quickly about something that's also quite close to your heart, and that's Scotland, of course. We're hearing from Nicola Sturgeon. She said, I've had enough of the UK government and we're going to have a referendum one way or another on independence. What would you say in response to her?
I went into the Scottish politics, Scottish Parliament with Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon's had enough of Westminster since 1999 when I went into the Scottish Parliament with her. The problem is she's had enough of that, but she hasn't actually done her job of delivering for the people of Scotland better healthcare, better schools, better crime rates, better education, and all the things that are really important to people of Scotland. And instead, she's desperate, I think, now to have a second referendum, even though all the promises were a referendum is a once in a generation. Well, there was a a referendum. It was all pretty much handed over to the Scottish Parliament to decide on everything from its wording to its timing. They had the referendum. They lost the referendum. And instead of them saying, OK, hands up, let's try and see if there's a better way, let's try and better the people of Scotland's experience with public services, she's just banged on the same one-trick pony. I think the problem for Nicola is time is running out. And, you know, I think she knows, because for all the sort of spin she put on separation, she knows that every day that goes past, every day further away from her sort of referendum zeal or the division that she stoked up the first time round, people are feeling that belonging to the United Kingdom is probably a better option. And the reason they want to belong to the United Kingdom is, if you look at COVID, the scale of support to Scotland could only have been delivered by a greater political union. If you look at defence, you've got President Putin taking nuclear on numerous occasions. And, you know, people in Scotland realise that we are greater together, better together as a nation.
OK, you've definitely had your three-shredded week this morning. I can't get a word in edgeways. Just one final question before I let you go. Pressure on the PM. Harriet Harman, chair of the Privileges Committee, new chair of the Privileges Committee, that will be looking into Partygate and the Prime Minister. Any concerns about her appointment?
No, it's a matter for Parliament. You know, I leave it to the parliamentary arithmetic, the people on the panel. You know, those committees are deliberately set up so that we have an opposition member chairing that panel. That's how governments and standards should be held to account. We often do that on a range of different select committees. But I think the reality is, yes, of course, she's the chair. I'm sure all the MPs on there will look at the facts and take their own decision.